The cool night air of Los Angeles carried a gentle breeze, rustling the leaves of the tall palm trees that surrounded the luxurious estate of Rick Michaels. Rick was a music superstar, a man who had traveled all around the world, adored by millions. His voice had touched the hearts of ladies and girls everywhere, bringing him wealth and unparalleled fame. Yet, beneath the glittering surface of his success, there was a profound emptiness. He was a whale in a vast ocean of scavengers, surrounded by people who saw him not as a human being, but as a machine that generated endless streams of money. On this particular evening, the mansion was quiet, save for the soft sound of a distant song playing on a record player. April Dayton, a kind and sensitive young woman with bright eyes and a gentle soul, was walking beside him. She was different from the usual crowds that followed him. She looked at him with genuine care, seeing the exhausted man behind the shining star persona. They wandered toward the back of the estate, where the large swimming pool was undergoing renovations. The pool was completely empty, its bottom covered in fresh plaster and scattered tools. Rick laughed softly, a sound that carried a hint of genuine happiness for the first time in months. He stepped playfully onto the diving board, balancing himself over the deep, empty concrete basin. April smiled, but a wave of concern washed over her. She called out to him, asking him to come down and be careful. Rick turned, his eyes locking with hers. For a fleeting second, he felt a spark of pure, unadulterated joy. But as he shifted his weight, his expensive Italian leather shoes lost their grip on the smooth surface of the diving board. He slipped. The world seemed to move in slow motion as he fell downward, striking his head against the hard floor of the empty pool. He lay there, completely motionless. April screamed his name. She scrambled down the steps into the basin, her heart pounding in her chest. She knelt beside him, calling out to him, begging him to wake up. Her hands trembled as she touched his shoulder. He did not respond. Panic, cold and overwhelming, gripped her mind. She ran toward the pool house to use the telephone, her breath coming in short, erratic gasps. She managed to dial a number, reaching out to her trusted friend Smitty. But before she could explain the situation, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps and voices approaching the estate. Fearing that the incoming people were strangers or opportunists who would harm him further, and entirely consumed by shock, April dropped the telephone and fled into the dark night, leaving behind one of her shoes near the edge of the pool. The voices belonged to Sue Page and Philip Rooney, the two business managers who controlled every aspect of Rick and his financial life. They walked into the backyard, arguing about contracts and banking statements. Sue was a sharp, calculating woman who believed she was the sole reason for the success of their management firm. Philip was her equally ambitious partner. When they reached the edge of the pool, they stopped dead in their tracks. There, at the bottom, lay their biggest client. Philip rushed down, checking for signs of life. The night was dark, and in his panic he assumed the absolute worst. He looked up at Sue, his face pale, and declared that the young star was gone. Instead of showing sorrow or reaching for the telephone to call for an ambulance, Sue stood perfectly still. Her mind, always moving like a brilliant but cold machine, began to calculate the financial impact. If the world found out that Rick Michaels was dead, the management firm of Rooney and Page would lose everything. There would be no more concert tours, no more album sales, and certainly no commissions for managing a deceased artist. Sue looked at Philip, her eyes narrowing with a sudden, audacious idea. She told him that they must not rush into calling the authorities. She explained that the executives at the record companies, Carl Ludwig and Earl Sampson, stood to lose millions of dollars if Rick failed to complete his tours and albums. Sue proposed a plan born of pure greed. They would hide Rick, pretend he had been kidnapped, and demand a ransom of $500,000 from the record executives. Philip thought she had lost her mind, but the promise of such a massive sum of money clouded his judgment. Together, they found an old wheelbarrow, moved Rick through the shadows, and transported him away from the estate, hiding him in an abandoned structure near a remote garbage dump. They did not realize that Rick was not dead at all. He was only deeply unconscious, holding onto a fragile thread of life. The next morning, the The bright California sun brought no warmth to the hearts of those who loved April. She had vanished, and her sudden disappearance deeply troubled her friends. Among them was a loyal confidant who realized that April, a fragile young woman who required daily medication for her health, would never run away without a word. Desperate, the friend reached out to a man known for his incredible intellect and deep compassion, Mr. Barnaby Jones. Barnaby Jones was a seasoned private investigator. He was a gentleman of the highest order, possessing a sharp mind, a warm smile, and an unwavering dedication to the truth. Working alongside him was Betty, his brilliant and caring assistant. When Barnaby heard the story of the missing young woman, his heart went out to her. He agreed to take the case immediately. Barnaby began his search at the estate of Rick Michaels. The moment he arrived, he noticed the chaotic state of the grounds. The gardener was deeply upset, complaining loudly to anyone who would listen. Someone had foolishly turned on the water system in the middle of the night, ruining the fresh plaster in the pool and destroying the newly planted grass. Barnaby listened patiently, his keen eyes scanning the area. He noticed deep wheel ruts in the mud and a set of footprints. Near the edge of the pool, he found a single shoe. It was a delicate woman's shoe, and on the heel, there were traces of dried plaster. Barnaby approached the main house and introduced himself to Sue Page. He politely asked if she knew the whereabouts of April Dayton, mentioning that she had been with Rick the previous night. Sue, maintaining a mask of cold professionalism, dismissed him, claiming that Rick was far too busy a man to keep track of every girl he met. She refused to let Barnaby speak to the singer, closing the door firmly. Undeterred, Barnaby returned to his office to confer with Betty. He had a strong feeling that the shoe belonged to April. Betty, who had been diligently researching April and her background, discovered a crucial piece of information. April suffered from a medical condition that required her to take a specific medicine called Oronase every single day. Without it, she would become dangerously ill. Realizing that time was running out, Barnaby asked Betty to contact local doctors and pharmacists in the West Los Angeles area. If April was hiding and needed her medicine, she would eventually have to reach out for help. Meanwhile, at the management office, the deceptive plan of Sue and Philip was fully in motion. They summoned Carl Ludwig and Earl Sampson, the two powerful record company executives. Sue, feigning deep distress, handed them a fake ransom note. She claimed they had found it at the estate that morning and that Rick had been kidnapped. Carl and Earl were horrified. They had invested millions of dollars into Rick and his upcoming music projects. When Sue revealed that the kidnappers were demanding $500,000, the executives hesitated. They suggested calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But Sue quickly manipulated their fears, arguing that involving the authorities would put Rick in grave danger. She reminded them of the immense profits they would lose if Rick did not return. Driven by a mix of genuine concern for the young man and a strong desire to protect their financial investments, the executives agreed to raise the money. Back in the streets of the city, April was weak and terrified. She had sought refuge with Smitty, a kind-hearted man who lived modestly but looked out for those in need. Smitty could see that April was deteriorating rapidly without her Oronase. Despite her fear of being found by the people she heard at the estate, she begged Smitty to help her get the medicine. Through a network of careful inquiries, Barnaby and Betty tracked down Smitty. Barnaby met with him, offering a generous sum of money not as a bribe, but as a sincere gesture to ensure April received the medical care she desperately needed. Smitty, realizing that Barnaby was an honorable man who truly wanted to help, agreed to cooperate. At the same time, Sue and Philip were orchestrating the fake ransom drop. They set up a clever scheme using a public telephone booth and an automatic dialing machine to make it seem as though the kidnappers were calling them with instructions. They directed the panicked executives to bring the $500,000 to a specific luggage department in a Valley store. Everything was going exactly as the two greedy managers had planned. However, they vastly underestimated the brilliant deductive skills of Barnaby Jones. Barnaby had collected samples of the dirt and crushed rocks from the tires of Philip Rooney and his expensive automobile. He brought the evidence to Betty, who meticulously analyzed the fragments. The combination of decomposed granite, specific types of industrial refuse, and the dried plaster from the pool painted a very clear geographic picture. Barnaby realized that the managers had traveled to an isolated disposal area near the Mulholland district. Putting the pieces together, Barnaby concluded that Rick had not been kidnapped by strangers. He had suffered an accident at the pool, and his own managers were using the tragedy to steal $500,000. Worse, Barnaby feared for the life of April, knowing that if Sue and Philip discovered she was a witness to their presence at the estate, they would try to silence her forever. His fears were justified. Sue had received word from her street contacts that April was staying with Smitty. In a desperate attempt to cover their tracks before they collected the final ransom money, Sue and Philip broke into Smitty and his apartment while he was away getting the medicine. They found April weak and defenseless. Without a shred of pity, they used a cloth soaked in a sleeping agent to render her unconscious, planning to take her away so she could never tell the truth about what she heard at the pool. But hope is a powerful force, and justice always finds a way to shine through the darkest moments. Barnaby, alongside the local police authorities, arrived at the apartment just in time. They intercepted Sue and Philip as they tried to escape. The two greedy managers were immediately apprehended. Barnaby rushed to April, ensuring that she was breathing and safe. When Smitty arrived moments later with the Oronase, they quickly administered the life-saving medicine to the brave young woman. With April safe, Barnaby turned his sharp focus to the most urgent matter, finding Rick Michaels. Confronted by the overwhelming evidence and the stern, unyielding presence of the law, the cowardly Philip confessed everything. He revealed the location of the abandoned structure near the Mulholland dump where they had left the young singer. The police cars raced through the winding roads, their sirens cutting through the quiet afternoon. Barnaby led the search team into the dark, forgotten building. There, hidden away from the world, they found Rick. To the absolute joy and relief of everyone present, Rick was still breathing. The cool environment of the structure and his own youthful resilience had kept him alive. Paramedics rushed to his side, providing him with oxygen and emergency care. As they lifted him onto a stretcher, his eyes fluttered open. The first thing he saw was the kind, reassuring face of Barnaby Jones. In the days that followed, the dark clouds that had surrounded Rick Michaels completely dissipated, giving way to a bright and beautiful new chapter. April recovered fully. She visited Rick in the hospital every day, bringing flowers, warm smiles, and a sense of genuine peace that Rick had never known before. He realized that the accident was a profound wake-up call. He had been living a life moving entirely too fast, surrounded by people who only cared about his wealth. But in April, and in the noble actions of people like Barnaby and Smitty, he saw the true value of human connection, love, and loyalty. Sue Page and Philip Rooney faced the severe consequences of their actions. They were charged with extortion, kidnapping, and severe endangerment. Their management empire crumbled to dust, a powerful lesson that greed and deceit ultimately lead to one and his own destruction. Carl and Earl, the record executives, were profoundly grateful for the safe return of their star. They pledged to treat him not merely as an investment, but as a valued partner and friend, ensuring that his future contracts were fair and supportive of his well-being. When Rick was finally discharged from the hospital, he did not return to his wild, chaotic ways. Instead, he and April took a long, quiet walk through a beautiful botanical garden. The sun was shining brightly, casting golden rays upon the blooming flowers. He held her hand, a gesture simple yet overflowing with deep affection and gratitude. He promised her, and himself, that his next song would not be about the superficial lights of the world, but about the profound beauty of second chances, the strength of the human spirit, and the enduring power of true love. Barnaby Jones sat in his comfortable office, sipping a warm cup of milk, smiling as he read a beautifully handwritten thank you letter from Rick and April. Betty walked in, placing a fresh file on his desk. She asked him if he was ready for a new adventure. Barnaby simply nodded, his heart full of peace, knowing that in a world that can sometimes be driven by darkness, There will always be an abundance of light, compassion, and people willing to do the right thing.